Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. This Saturday is UFC 294, Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski 2. And as much as I love this card, as much as it's an amazing stacked fight card, there are some reasons I hate UFC 294, and this is going to be my top 3 reasons I hate UFC 294. I'm going to start with a couple honorable mentions, then I'm going to get into my actual list, saving last on the list for the reason I most hate UFC 294. And believe me, I think a lot of people are going to disagree with it, and a lot of people are going to criticize me down in the comments for my number 1 reason, but we'll discuss that later in the video. Starting off with my first honorable mention, and that is that Jinyu Frey is on this card. That Cedriquez Dumas is on this card. This card is stacked. The prelims are stacked. Every fight is pretty much amazing outside of those 2 fights. And while I can understand, okay, every fight's not going to be an outright banger on paper, it would be a real shame if during fight week, Jinyu Frey versus Victoria Dudakova got canceled last minute. It'd be a real shame. It'd be a real shame if Cedriquez Dumas pulled out or Abu Azaitar pulled out and the fight got canceled. I just don't care for either one of those matchups. Jinyu Frey doesn't even belong in the UFC. Why is she still in the UFC? She does nothing but lose, essentially. Why is she still in the UFC? And then Cedriquez Dumas, I know he beat Cody Brundage in his last fight, but the fact that he even went to decision with him is an embarrassment in itself. And Cody Brundage, I think, could have won that fight if he didn't pull guillotine nonstop. Every single round, he's pulling guillotine nonstop and then can't get up off his back. He quit the second he went into that fight. Apparently, he does that every single fight. So those 2 fights, again, they're not the worst fights in the world. And in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter all that much because the card is stacked. But right now, the current bout order, the reason I'm so annoyed about Jinyu Frey is, why isn't that opening up the card? Why is Bruno Silva versus Sharabut Magomedov opening up the card? Makes absolutely no sense. So kind of a mixture of that fight and then the bout order. I hate that about UFC 294. Makes no sense. Jinyu Frey versus Victoria Dudakova. Wish it wasn't on UFC 294. Moving on to my next honorable mention, and that is, I really hate that the UFC Countdown film crew got absolutely screwed with this card. I mean, how much useless hours of footage do they have of Paulo Costa and Charles Oliveira shadow boxing on a beach in Brazil somewhere? I mean, they flew all around the world getting all this different footage, all for the card to get shuffled all around last minute. So I just feel bad for the film crew. I know they must be absolutely seething. I mean, they spent hours probably filming Paulo Costa running on the beach and shadow boxing on the beach in Brazil, all for the fight to get canceled against Khamzat Chimaev and the Charles Oliveira Islam Makhachev fight to get canceled. Imagine how much useless footage they have. You ever think you're useless? Imagine being the UFC Countdown crew for UFC 294 up until a week ago. You know, they wasted all that time. So I just thought that was kind of funny to include. Moving on to my next honorable mention, and that's just fight cancellations in general. I mean, one that really hits hard is Nasruddin Imavov versus Ikram Aliskerov. Nasruddin Imavov had to pull out, supposedly with visa issues, and we get Warley Alves to step in. And, you know, I know the other 2 fights that got canceled, we got suitable replacements, but this one I hate. I hate Ikram Aliskerov. I was looking forward to seeing him tested. They announced him against Paulo Costa. Then they announced him against Nasruddin Imavov. I'm like, oh, Ikram, we're going to find out if he's the real deal very, very soon. They're throwing him in the deep end right away. And then just like that, the Paulo Costa fight, which I never expected to happen, got canceled. That was supposed to happen in summer, I think UFC 291. And then, okay, we get this fight. I'm hyped for it. Nasruddin Imavov has to pull out with visa issues. Then, of course, you have the co-main event, Khamzat Chimaev versus Paulo Costa. I understand the Kamaru Usman replacement is still a very good fight, but Khamzat Chimaev and Paulo Costa have been talking crap for what seems like a year and a half. And I just wish that fight would have stayed together. I was looking forward to that fight. And unfortunately, it gets canceled. Paulo Costa has staph infection, has multiple surgeries on his elbow, and the fight can't go forward. And it's just super disappointing. And then you have Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira 2. I was kind of lukewarm on that potential idea in general. And then Charles Oliveira goes out there and starches Beneil Dariush. And I'm like, you know what? I kind of like that rematch. I'm kind of intrigued by that rematch now. And of course, 10 days before the fight, 11 days before the fight, Charles Oliveira is sparring. Why is he sparring 11 days before the fight, enough to get cut? So I hate Charles Oliveira for sparring 11 days before the fight. Low fight IQ move, or not even low fight IQ, low IQ move in general. It doesn't make any sense. But I understand different guys do different things for their training camps, but just disappointed in all those fight cancellations. Moving on to my actual list, starting off with number 3, and I know I'm going to get a lot of heat for this one as well, and that is the start time of UFC 294. The prelims are starting at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The main card is starting at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. I despise it. This is almost the equivalent of that ugly yellow canvas they used at UFC 200. I hate these start times. And I know there's other people around the world who are fans who are going to comment down below and say, well, we get one event for a change and it's in prime time. It's going to be perfect for us. I am very happy for you. I'm genuinely happy that you get a good start time. But for me, we're spoiled here. I'm used to 6 p.m. early prelims, 8 p.m. Prelims, televised prelims, and then 10 p.m. main card start time. And for me, when they start the prelims at 10 a.m., I'm already up, but I have stuff to do on Saturday. And then it's like, okay, now my whole Saturday during the day is taken up. And then Saturday night, I'm like, what am I supposed to do? I feel weird. I feel like I'm supposed to be watching fights, but I'm not watching fights. So it throws everything off for me personally. It just feels weird. I can't explain it anything other than that. It just feels weird to me because it's like everything's earlier on in the day. There's no fights to watch at night. I'm done all my videos by like 6, 8 p.m. basically because the fight card essentially goes off around 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And it just throws off absolutely everything. And it feels incredibly weird. And I absolutely hate that timing. I'm happy for other people around the world, the fact that they get a good prime time start time. But for me, I hate it. I absolutely hate it. There was a time where the UFC would do pay-per-views. They start the main card at 9 p.m. Eastern. I thought that was perfect. They eventually went back to 10 p.m. Eastern, which I don't mind. I don't mind a little bit earlier. I don't mind like 8 p.m., 7 p.m. But 2 p.m. Eastern Time, I'm not a big fan, and they do it every year for the Abu Dhabi card. I understand why. The Abu Dhabi government is paying them well to do it, but ultimately, I hate the start time for UFC 294. Moving on to my number 2 reason I hate UFC 294, and that is that Kamaru Usman versus Khamzat Chimaev isn't 5 rounds. Now, I know it doesn't necessarily make sense considering Kamaru Usman is stepping in on short notice, but originally we were supposed to get Paulo Costa versus Khamzat Chimaev, and that wasn't 5 rounds either. And I feel like when you have fights of these magnitude, I feel like it should be 5 rounds. The UFC and Dana White are saying, okay, Kamaru Usman, Khamzat Chimaev winner is fighting for the middleweight title. Then why don't we get 5 rounds? Why aren't we getting 5 rounds? You look back to, I believe it was UFC 273 when we had Khamzat Chimaev versus Gilbert Burns. I made this same video discussing 273, and I said I hate that this isn't 5 rounds. And everyone told me, well, there's going to be a finish anyway. It doesn't matter, blah, blah, blah. Look what the fight we had. We had an outright war. I would have loved a 4th and 5th round. And what's crazy is the UFC over the past couple years has started doing 5-round non-main event, non-title fights. They did it for Nate Diaz, Leon Edwards. They did it for Nick Diaz, Robbie Lawler. I think they did it for, RDA versus Renato Moicano? They did it for all 3 of those fights. Renato Moicano even came in on short notice and fought 5 rounds. He got bludgeoned. That should have never been 5 rounds, as a matter of fact. But they do it for those fights, but we can't do it for a fight like Khamzat Chimaev versus Kamaru Usman. Why? Why aren't we normalizing? We really need to normalize when we have a massive co-main event, whether it be on a big fight night card or whether it be on a big pay-per-view. We need to normalize making it 5 rounds. I understand the UFC doesn't necessarily want to do it, but in this fight, we've never seen Khamzat Chimaev go 5 rounds. Now, granted, there could be a stoppage. We might never need those 4th and 5th rounds. But I would love to see, if Khamzat's going to be fighting for a title after this, I would love to see how his cardio would look in a 4th and 5th round. It just makes perfect sense. It used to be kind of an unwritten rule. Before you got a title shot, you had to compete in at least one 5-round fight. Obviously, not all of those went to 5 rounds, but it was kind of an unwritten rule in MMA. They used to do it far more often where you had to be in a 5-round fight before getting a title shot. But, this fight, granted, it may get stopped early. It may be a 1st round stoppage, 2nd round stoppage for either guy. But I wish we had those extra rounds just in case. And it should have been that way for Khamzat Chimaev versus Paulo Costa as well. Why wouldn't we have that big fight? Why would we not have it for 5 rounds? It just doesn't make any sense to me. I guess the UFC doesn't want to pay him extra money to be able to fight that 4th and 5th round. Moving on to my number 1 reason I hate UFC 294. and I already know a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this one, but that is that the main and co-main event are short notice fights. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. I'm not saying I want them to be canceled. I understand this is the best the UFC could do on short notice, but it just leaves an asterisk next to both of those fights. It doesn't matter what happens. If Islam Makhachev goes out there and destroys Alexander Volkanovski, there'll be an asterisk next to it. People will say, oh, well, he only beat Alexander Volkanovski on 11 days notice. If he beats him and it's not dominant enough, it'll be like, oh, he couldn't beat a 45er short notice. And then if Volkanovski wins, don't get me wrong, that'd be one of the craziest moments in MMA history and UFC history. But then it'd be like, oh, well, Islam deserves a rematch or a trilogy because he was training for Charles Oliveira and they changed up the matchup on him. And, maybe he wasn't expecting this or expecting that. No matter what goes down, there'll be a narrative. There'll be a narrative that it's just like, okay, well, oh, this fight doesn't count. Even if Islam Makhachev wins, and let's say he wins dominantly, and I talked about this in a recent video, years from now, they'll be saying, oh, well, that second win over Volk doesn't really matter because it was short notice. And that first one, Alexander Volkanovski, was robbed. That's what people will say when they're discussing the lightweight GOAT discussion. And then also, on top of that, for the co-main event, it's like Khamzat Chimaev versus Kamaru Usman. I understand that's still a great fight, but I wish both guys had full training camps. I wish they did, because now we're not going to know. I feel like Khamzat Chimaev, I know this sounds crazy. I've been a big believer in Khamzat Chimaev for a while. I feel like he still isn't 100% tested. The best fighter he's fought is Gilbert Burns. He had a very close fight, an absolute war with Gilbert Burns. And now it's like he's been out for a while. It feels like he hasn't fought anyone in the last 2 years. I know that's an exaggeration. He fought Kevin Holland last year and he beat him. But Kevin Holland isn't the elite of the elite. We're talking about giving Khamzat Chimaev a title shot next. If he beats Kamaru Usman, there's going to be that cloud looming over it that it's like, oh, well, all right, well, it was Kamaru Usman on 11 days notice. That's what's going to be. That's what people are going to discuss. So it's not going to mean as much. No matter who wins, it's not going to mean as much, especially if the guy who was scheduled to fight on UFC 294 the entire time wins the fight. No matter how they win it, it's not going to mean as much just because it was a short notice fight taken by Kamaru Usman or Alexander Volkanovski. I absolutely hate short notice fights. And on top of that, you can add this as like a 1A reason. I hate that we're not getting Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria. I love an active champion like Alexander Volkanovski, and Topuria was the true #1 contender. He looked like a world beater, beating the crap out of Josh Emmett in his last fight. He's on a long win streak. He's undefeated. And it was like, okay, Volkanovski, he's coming off that win over Yair Rodriguez, looks better than ever. Topuria looked really good in his last fight. I couldn't wait to see Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria. And now that's kind of up in the air. That's really up in the air because Volkanovski said and maybe he still fights in January, but it depends how much damage he takes at UFC 294. So there's a chance, there's truly a chance that we never get Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria. And also, with this fight, we're kind of clogging up two divisions right now. Because if Volkanovski wins, what happens at featherweight? An interim title fight? Even if he loses, if he wants to sit out for 4 or 5 months afterwards, then we're going to have to do an interim title fight. They're talking about Max Holloway fighting Topuria for an interim belt. If Max Holloway wins the interim belt, who wants to see Volkanovski versus Holloway for? I certainly don't. I certainly don't at all. So it just, it's short notice fights with high stakes on the line. You got Dana White guaranteeing the winner of the co-main event a title shot at middleweight, which really doesn't make sense. Dricus du Plessis deserves a title shot right now, which I'm going to make an entire dedicated video on that. But there's so many things that I can pick apart about this main and co-main event. But it is what it is. It's still a solid card. These are just the top 3 reasons I hate UFC 294. I've already done a bunch of UFC 294 content. I will link my entire playlist down in the description. I'll also be doing a top 3 reasons I love UFC 294. So make sure you check that out as well. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.